The opinions expressed by the host and guests in this show are not necessarily the views of Children's Health Defense.
Good morning, CHD. We are back. I am bringing you Escape Key again to talk some more about his discoveries that help us explain what is going on with the Great Reset, what are the mechanics of it, how was the architecture built, who built it, when was it built, what is it trying to accomplish, and how is it using our emotions, our feeling, inducing guilt and shame in us in order to make us agree to follow these so-called ethical precepts that, or what many people would refer to as virtue signaling, in order to carry out the requirements of the Great Reset to get us into a complete control grid. And so in addition to Escape Key, I have Catherine Austin Fitz here. So the three of us are going to get into a discussion of what's going on, how does it work, and why don't you just start telling us, Escape Key, what's important, and then Catherine and I will jump in as necessary.
I fundamentally think probably the most important concept to understand is fundamentally that what's taking place right now is that the sort of democratic world that we believe or we're told that we live in is fundamentally being replaced by a model which is centered around a clearinghouse. And the clearinghouse structure itself fundamentally kind of comes, or at least what I've traced it back to, kind of basically is the London bank clearinghouse structure, kind of which fundamentally put the Bank of England at the very top, basically, of the sort of at the apex of the sort of power pyramid.
Let me interrupt you already. So what you've said is that we are told we're living in a democracy, all of us, and you're in the UK, we're in the US, and many other countries, but we are in fact not living in a democracy. It's becoming less and less of a democracy as a control grid is being installed. And the central feature of the control grid is putting a clearinghouse or putting a mechanism in between buyers and sellers, and two people who want to transact about anything, or two entities that want to transact, will no longer be able to do so freely, and in some cases already can't, because whatever the transaction is, it has to be approved by this clearinghouse that has been inserted in between the two entities that want to transact. I hope that's clear, and I'll let you get going again.
Yeah, no, that's fairly accurate. Basically, kind of what's happening is that you have at the very top of society, you got like some sort of fundamental ethic, and there'll be the sustainable development goals, like for instance, clean oceans or something like something which no one can disagree with, right? I mean, you cannot sort of say you don't want quality education or clean oceans. It's going to make you appear like some sort of loon, right? But fundamentally, the trick is kind of so you have an ethic, but no one really explains to you how does that actually sort of funnel into law. And what fundamentally happens is basically this is then sort of converted into a set of standards, which fundamentally is sort of a way of measuring whether the oceans are clean or sort of whether you receive kind of basically education required. It fundamentally turns into a standard, and once we have a standard, kind of we can perform surveillance in general, kind of basically can compare whether the results are good enough, and that's fundamentally the job of the clearinghouse. And what's sort of interesting in that regard is fundamentally the clearinghouse itself is not ultimately kind of basically where the power rests, but it is the sort of visible part which sort of judges you basically as it is right now. I can go further into depth here, but you might want to translate at this stage.
Oh, yeah. But what I'd like to mention is, Escape, the reason I find your Substack so valuable is that you are able to go back through history and show how all these different sets of rules and standards get built through time, and how we create international organizations, some who have sovereign immunity, and they enter into all these international treaties that create this invisible layer. And then we have technology that's creating standards. And you describe this sort of web of invisible, whether it's sustainable development goals or tech standards, this invisible control web that is outside of, and in some cases supersedes, our democratic institutions. And it's by reading through your description of the evolution of this coming together in the clearinghouse that I think is such a valuable way of understanding how this all, how we've reached the point that we've reached. Because when you hear it for the first time in its full, its full blossoming now, you think, how could all of this happen? Did me not know? And by going back and showing how this evolved with many different people in many different parts, not seeing how they come together, but you bring it together in a way that we can see it whole and how it all connects into becoming this control grid. So with the clearinghouse as the rule enforcing mechanism in the middle, if I could call it that. Is that
Yeah,
your perception?
that's yeah, that's a pretty accurate sort of summary. I mean, fundamentally, it traces back to a report which should be, quite frankly, sort of front page news. Basically, Fabian report from 1916 called International Government, and it puts that kind of basically kind of like the blueprint is right there. Fundamentally, the strategy is to transfer sovereign sort of powers away, basically from the nation state and onto kind of international organizations, which is basically kind of what you'd call an NGO today. And there's a lot of talk about the multipolar sort of world order and stuff like that. And that's actually slightly missing the point, because the point in the multipolar sort of world order, which in particular Chatham House are very active in promoting, is not actually the nation states themselves. It's the fact that basically all the nation states basically adhere to the same sort of set of standards, basically, and the same, the same rules. Basically, what is they call the rule-based world order, or whatever they called it out post World War II.
What Escape Key just told you is that the Fabian Society in 1916, 110 years ago, came up with a strategy. And they weren't the only organizations. You'll learn later about how the Nazis came up with a similar strategy and the Bolsheviks came up with a similar strategy. And, if you go fast forward, you'll find that the people who Jeffrey Epstein was working with came up with a similar strategy. So they all had the same blueprint, which was developed at the end of the 1800s and the very early 1900s, of how to gain control of societies by creating this clearinghouse mechanism, the mechanism that would determine whether two people could interact in some way. Right. And of course, now you can actually implement this clearinghouse system in real time, instantaneously, using surveillance and computing power. And AI and all these AI data banks, which are going to be necessary to implement the type of tight control that is desired. They had 110 years to develop this. And as I said, it was developed partly by the Nazis, by the so there's been a lot of experiments, and a lot of pieces have been created in different countries that are being then moved into the successful experiments, moved into other countries. And so the whole system is being built like a spider web, with us not knowing what's going on, and suddenly these standards and rules appear, and you got the same rules in different countries, and we don't know where it came from.
So I just want to point out that when you're describing the Fabian Society in 1916, that is right after the Federal Reserve took control of monetary policy in the US. And then the discussion started, and what the creation of the clearinghouse is basically doing is their goal is to take over fiscal policy as well. So right now it's the legislatures and the democratic institutions where the legislators make the rules about what taxes are collected and how the tax money is spent, and the executive branch sort of manages and enforces the rules. And what the clearinghouse does through the financial system is put the bankers in a position where they can control all of that as well. So literally after they took control of monetary policy, they went to work on taking control of the rest.
One of the essays I wrote a while back was on Keynes's general theory, which was published in 1936, and it's quite an interesting period of time because in 1930, obviously the Bank for International Settlements came to be, which was fundamentally founded on the same principle as the Bank of England and the Federal Reserve, right? But it was founded on basis of a template which was first outlined in 1892 by this German chap sort of called Julius Wolff, and in 1930. Fundamentally, they're all sort of based on the gold standard, right? Kind of because without the gold standard at that point in time, no one would agree. Any sort of like common anchor, it's sort of the medium of exchange between the nations, right? Kind of it's called, for central banks certainly. They standardized basically with gold, but almost as soon as they'd agreed to the gold standard, kind of the Royal Institute of International Affairs, they basically started out basically writing a report kind of demolishing the gold standard, and within a few months UK basically went off kind of the gold standard, then released another published another two reports in 1933, 1935, which fundamentally developed the case kind of basically since for monetary and fiscal policy sort of working together. In 1936 obviously we got Keynes publishing his general theory kind of which essentially was the public sort of face basically since to that entire sort of initiative. And it's interesting really because basically kind of what fundamentally Keynes did by publishing that was basically kind of the realization with regards to Keynesian economics is essentially the idea is the kind of cyclical sort of kind of in good times you save and the bad times you sort of spend from your savings, and that's going to work for a household, of course, or you as an individual, but it's not going to work for a nation state because fundamentally, a politician who starts saving during the good times will immediately lose his seat. The very second kind of where government actually takes serious steps to start like kind of sort of saving up kind of during the good times, kind of basically since the opposition is going to be elected. So it fundamentally doesn't work. So very, very slowly, very gradually, it's going to build up debts, and that's fundamentally, sort of what took place afterwards. And what's interesting in that regard is basically kind of when you separate fiscal policy and monetary policy in this regard, then you effectively kind of get a government kind of basically which can shape the economy kind of politically, right? But in order to do so, they become completely dependent upon central bankers, because basically if central banks don't fundamentally approve with accommodative sort of like monetary policy, then nothing will happen.
So Keynes was the guy who justified the creation of the debt trap. And once you've got everybody in the debt trap, you control. In your latest piece, you describe how the central bankers are working with the equity pools and doing these policies that create, tremendous asset wealth for the equity pools. And it was Keynes that justified a lot of those policies that do that. So
absolutely. Kind of basically, I mean, Keynesian economics. I mean, you can argue that monetarism kind of basically sort of did its sort of part as well, basically. But yes, fundamentally, it comes down to sort of Keynesian economics, and kind of I mean, it is kind of amusing, isn't it? Because certainly during 2008, we were all told kind of basically unless we do this, kind of everyone's sort of pension is sort of toast. And personally, I had a number of colleagues who couldn't think of anything worse, right? Kind of, so they didn't really think about it. Kind of, it's the rest of this sort of equation. But fundamentally, kind of when you trace it back to it, kind of basically, it ultimately serves to inflate, sort of basic asset prices, and kind of fundamentally puts the organizations in power, which it is or benefits the organizations, which basically per Keynes himself is not the intent. And that's fundamentally kind of where it comes back to, basically when you look at it from a cybernetic perspective, you don't tend to analyze about basically what people's claimed intent is, because anyone could say anything at any point in time, right? Marx said a lot of things that, like intent and kind of outcome are basically kind of sort of drastically different. But basically, kind of you look at what the system actually produces, and the simple fact is essentially with time, you have a number, sort of BlackRock, whatever, kind of basic Vanguard, State Street, Fidelity, sitting on colossal pools of money, which only ever tends to grow. And it's very, very difficult for any politicians to stop this, because the very second kind of basically where they stop this, not only are these sort of pools of equity pools incredibly powerful, of course, but, they do have this sort of safety that in the event those kind of, organizations go down, they will take everyone's pension savings with them. So it's quite an uncomfortable sort of position to be in.
It makes them bulletproof.
So Meryl, you were instrumental in stopping the WHO from literally using their rule system to come in and control our neighborhoods and everything else. Now that you've discovered Escape's work, how does it help you now see what you were fighting at the WHO?
Well, I knew from the very beginning of COVID when, virtually all the developed nations in lockstep did all the same things, none of which made any sense. So I knew that there was a supranational entity that was controlling all of our nations. I also knew that taking control like that, in other words, gaining control of the prime ministers and presidents and top health officers would have cost many billions of dollars. So I thought, and would have taken a number of years. So as I realized it's a big plan, it's a big club. We're not in it. And there was something there, but nobody knew either the architecture or who the people were involved. And what Escape Key has done is to reverse engineer the architecture by understanding bits of it, going back and reading this tremendous number of old documents of government entities and non-governmental entities, and seeing how the UN system and the League of Nations set up non-governmental organizations to create standards, to unify rules around the world and to set this whole process in motion. And they didn't do all of it, but we can see how, for instance, Jeffrey Epstein was in charge of getting some of these pieces completed, and other people were at different times, and they all fit together. And clearly there were, during COVID, there must have been probably PR firms like McKinsey and focus groups trying to figure out how far we can push the public, how bad can we make the lockdowns, what's going to cause a revolution and what will they go along with, et cetera. And anyway, so Escape Key has shown that it was possible for the elites to do this, working in lockstep across party lines, across ideological lines. This is the most interesting thing, that the Bolsheviks were coming up with the same general plan, and then the Nazis, because all of them were, in essence, interested in controlling the population. And now, the so-called democratic governments of Europe and the United States, same deal. Republicans and Democrats, Labor and conservatives in the UK, doesn't matter. They're all doing the same thing. They're all owned by the same entities.
This divide and conquer between different parts of the Uniparty have kept us from seeing how they're all building literally one machinery. But
Absolutely.
they focus on different ways, or they have different donors who are different parts of the system. But
Right. So Trump is, supposedly getting rid of climate change, as a driver of much of this. But at the same time, he's implementing all the financial systems, more so even than the Democrats. And so we know basically he is part of the same system. He's just doing it differently.
right, all the climate change is going to come in through the rules. Now, one of the things both Escape and you really got me to see much more clearly is what I now call the virtue scam. How much a part of getting the clearinghouse implemented is using sort of moral values to guilt people into going along with this. Maybe if you two could talk about that.
So I see it as, again, they're playing the long game. So it's been since 1970 that we've had Earth Day, right? So that's what, 55 years ago. There has been a big push to give nature its due, to give back, to recycle. And yet the system has not fought against some of the most insidious forms of pollution. For instance, geoengineering, they're spraying us with all kinds of stuff from the sky. That's terrible pollution. And, they pretend it doesn't exist. So they don't really care about nature. They're despoiling nature. But they have also induced in most young people a feeling that the earth is being destroyed, the earth is dying, and that it's their personal responsibility to do something, that humans have created this disaster, and we should be ashamed of ourselves. We are being guilt tripped into doing something, and the something is what they want us to do. And it's particularly insidious, with school children and college kids who want to do the right thing. So we've got, millions of kids who think that the best thing they could possibly do in life, is try to fight against climate change again by worrying about carbon credits, which is utter baloney. And even, I argued a lot with Ronnie Cummins. I said, this climate change thing is bullshit. He said, it isn't. He said, look, I've been watching the land. I have been seeing it get warmer. I've been seeing it dry up. Climate change is not bullshit. And I was like, well, in
What
some
about
parts
the
of the world,
spraying of the toxicity overhead? What's
yes,
that doing?
exactly. And, and it is getting warmer in some places. It's getting cooler in other places. The water level is rising in some places, it's going down in others. And the carbon markets, which is another way for elites to make tons of money on a complete scam, is something that these people have created as a solution, but it's no solution at all. But all these kids have been convinced it's like 1 and 1 is 2. We never question that 1 and 1 are 2, right?
Right.
And so kids never question that, by burying trees, or doing other things that are going to put carbon back into the soil and take it out of the atmosphere, that's going to save us from the existential threat of the planet dying from climate change. They
So,
don't even say global warming anymore because it hasn't been getting warmer, even though they pretend it has.
so Escape, how did you figure out the virtue game? How did you come to that? How did you
Well,
figure that out?
that was actually early 2024, because I just started noticing sort of the concept of ethics being here and there and everywhere, and it's odd, right? Because of all things, basically, I used to be on Twitter, right, and I spent probably a couple of weeks sitting going through Hollywood in the 1910s, and I found this sort of like kind of motion MPDA, Motion Picture Directors Association or something. And they put out like kind of this sort of 4 points program, of which one of the principles, sorry, kind of basically was, that we consider ourselves in the highest moral standing, and you sort of see that moral standing. I mean, what on earth is that supposed to mean, right? And then kind of the more I was sitting reading regards to all these links, kind of, I just saw morality left, right, and center. Kind of basically, it's just some sense, really artificial. Kind of, as in they're pushing this for some reason, but I hadn't quite worked out basically what it was. And then, basically, I think it was early 2024. Basically, the World Economic Forum posted a report about basically how we need to protect the minors or whatever, right? Basically, so consequently, we need to censor you on the internet, something along those lines. And I wrote an essay called "The Ethical Approach," where, because at that point in time, a lot of people were sort of saying, "Oh, this started just a few years ago," and that was my conclusion. Kind of basically, I started tracing it back, kind of against. I write back kind of basically in the 1980s, kind of basically with French communists basically having launched essentially a really long-term plan, kind of basically of sort of censorship, basically ultimately through ethics, right? But basically, I started writing a lot about basically global governance through global ethics on Twitter, and all of a sudden, out of nowhere, kind of basically my traction on Twitter kind of basically just sort of collapsed, and it was just sort of continuous. Basically, it was just like all of a sudden, whatever I kind of basically I posted, kind of it just didn't receive any traction. It was like sort of like, in hindsight, I do sort of think kind of it's one of the things you're not supposed to talk about. But I mean, in regards to sort of more in a more sort of contemporary sort of shape, right? You hear a lot about financial inclusion right now, right? And you know, like right now they're trying to build a digital public infrastructure, kind of basically in what 50 or 100 nations, kind of sort of G77, primarily sort of poorer nations. But it also applies to sort of Gaza and Ukraine and every other nation, kind of basically essentially they drop bombs on right now, right? Because what they fundamentally do is, once they've leveled kind of the country, they go in kind of basically and sort of say, okay, well, like here's some development loans, kind of, but there are just these conditions, and one of the conditions, obviously,
But we're here to help you. Now that we've destroyed your country, we're here to help
yeah,
you. And that means you move onto our platform where we control you.
Exactly, but the thing is, as it is right in contemporary setting, kind of they talk a lot about digital sort of public infrastructure, and what it fundamentally is basically digital ID surveillance, like 24/7 surveillance, kind of against central bank digital currencies, blah blah blah, which fundamentally means kind of in the old times of structural adjustment programs, they would put conditionality basically upon third world aid, right? But basically, kind of with this new sort of structure they're building in like up to upwards of 100 nations, they extend essentially the conditionality kind of not just to the nation or even to the company which has to pay more for debt, basically raising debt in debt markets, if they're not sort of adhering to the ethical principles. They will extend it all the way down to the individual. And fundamentally, if you think about it, it makes complete logical sense, because basically central bank digital currencies will effectively kind of basically have conditionalities sort of checks. So for instance, if I buy like whatever, an ice cream or whatever kind of is from you, yeah, then basically on a normal circumstance, I give you like a $5, kind of basically you sort of say, yeah, fine, we swap goods. But in the future, basically there's a third party, like, and I actually trace down to the Bank for International Settlements in Innovation Hub project Rosalind, which have got like a three-party lock sort of structure where essentially kind of, basically I'm the buyer, you're the seller, and then there's a third party which will approve kind of basically this sort of purchase. And fundamentally, kind of basically, when you consider the digital public infrastructure, right, which they're bringing in across G77 and all the nations that are busy bombing right now, basically, kind of like they are effectively shifting all the conditionality down to the level of the individual. So you can't even go down to the supermarket, kind of basically and buy a pint of milk, like unless you actually adhere to the ethical,
So,
objective.
so I have a slide that I just showed Meryl, based on your description of the 2-lock versus the 3-lock system. So in the first system, which we traditionally know, you have the buyer and the seller, and they have to agree. And what I do is I show another system where, there's a complex algorithm, which I call Mr. Global. So Mr. Global gets in the middle. And the beauty of it is it's not coming through the financial institution, so they can't, customer service can't help you. It's literally embedded in the money once you have the programming and the AI, and which makes it very unaccountable. And it's an extraordinary change because you can have highly complex rule systems that are responding in real time to surveillance and to your behavior. And you can integrate this, you can put all the rules of energy usage and integrate it with the money at the totally intimate level, one person at a time. So it's quite extraordinary. It's quite an extraordinary level of control, and to me, it's really the end of currency, because it's not a currency; it's just a control system.
Well, that's the interesting part, isn't it? Because if you read the Communist Manifesto, and Plank 5 says kind of get single central bank or state bank in control of all credit, not currency, credit. And now we're talking about everyone kind of basically having central bank digital currencies with conditionality. I mean, okay, so put two and two together. Can I get the step from Plank 5 to basically what's being developed is actually pretty minor.
Right. And what's amazing is if stablecoin succeeds, because stablecoins is just a public-private version of central bank digital currency. If stablecoin succeeds, it's going to suck all the money out of the local credit creation and right into the central system.
No, absolutely. It's I completely agree with you in that regard. Kind of basically, since what they fundamentally do is in some precincts like United States, you cannot introduce basically CBDC. Kind of basically, so what they do is basically just do it in a deceptive and dishonest way. I mean, they are very good at what they do. Kind of will not take any, not claim otherwise. Kind of, but it is fundamentally so deceptive that it just beggars belief.
So it's funny because, I have to explain this all the time, but, if the New York Fed or the Fed did CBDC, they are a creature of Congress, and they have tremendous reporting and disclosure obligations to Congress if Congress chooses to exercise them. Instead, this way, the people who own the New York Fed create subsidiaries, do stablecoins, and they have far less obligations to Congress, and they can, but instead of the central bank, it's the people who own the central bank. So the idea that this is somehow different other than worse, is, You just can't believe that anybody would think this is a good idea, but there you go.
It's a good idea for the owners, for a small number of people, and the way they get it, to the rest of us is through stealth. I mean, they've already had Congress pass the Genius Act, right? And they're going to pass another act, which enables stablecoins to be
Right.
used. I mean, Congress could have said no, but Congress is completely owned.
So the proposed regs are out now in the Genius Act, and the final regs won't go final until the end of this year. So the blossoming of this, we probably won't see till next year. The Clarity Act is the second act, and it's still being debated. And one of my questions for Escape is, we've been working to pass state legislation to stop programmable money from being used to control people. And I think Meryl was mentioning today the notion that they won't necessarily embed the algorithm in the currency or the financial transaction, but in the wallets instead. And I was wondering if you knew anything about that.
That's what they do in the European Union, yeah. I mean, normal people have some sort of level of internal morality, but I mean, these people just stand and lie. I mean, it's quite impressive, really. But yeah, fundamentally, what they do is basically so you have the central bank digital currency transaction itself, and obviously, it kind of comes with ISO 20022 sort of metadata, which sort of describes kind of where the purchase sort of where the transaction takes place, kind of basically through CBAM regulation in Europe. Soon there will be basically kind of an amount of carbon dioxide emitted basically during the development kind of basically of whatever item, yada yada, and all this information will then be sent to effectively kind of basically your wallet, and your wallet will be checked if you have enough carbon credits and blah blah blah, and that's fundamentally kind of what he's saying.
Will the wallet be governed and managed by the ECB, or will they have private parties who are doing it and controlling through their terms and conditions?
I'm not sure exactly who will basically I would imagine. See, the way, general speaking, kind of basically like to do it. Have you ever read up basically on regionalism, which was basically essentially, the Rockefeller sort of term of research, basically decades ago? Because basically what they tend to like, kind of having some sort of super a national organization sort of like kind of come up with some sort of concept, and that's then implemented kind of basically at the local level. So effectively, all the nations in Europe basically will implement kind of basically this regulation, but the template for the regulation kind of basically will be centrally set. So if you've got a problem with it, kind of basically you can complain to the EU or whatever, whichever organization has come up basically with the
Good
idea.
luck.
Don't do anything because essentially it's your local sort of nation kind of which implements it, and the local nation will say, well, we have to do this because we have to adhere to the standards. So, I mean, it's very clever, kind of basically what they've done, but it's very, very deceptive.
If we want to be free and we want to do everything we can to add friction and slow this monster down, but also ultimately break free of it, what are the things that we can do in our personal lives to slow it down or to change the state of play?
I haven't really gone so much into it right now because fundamentally what I've tried to do basically is reverse engineer the sort of full system in order to understand basically what it actually does, and
Right.
and I think I've got a by and large a fairly sort of good understanding of it, and I can tell you basically the sort of rough sort of friction, basically the sort of stress points kind of basically in the structure. And fundamentally, obviously, kind of not allowing it to close would be a bloody good idea, right? But the other sort of thing is fundamentally everything is driven on basis of models, right? It's all about like kind of basically in 2001, Al Gore and Leon Fuerth, I don't know how it's pronounced, but they came up with the concept of basically forward engagement, which ultimately is anticipatory sort of governance. And what that fundamentally is essentially you run a black box, which obviously is unaccountable to anyone, because in the event it mispredicts kind of basically it's because it didn't have sufficient amount of surveillance information, and then we need to build more, right? Basically, but it's about sort of forward predicting and then essentially kind of producing sort of a governance model on basis of these forward predictions, which fundamentally is impossible, right? So the ultimate issue is essentially kind of that when you have a full system, basically through systems theory, you cannot allow sort of leaf nodes like basically individuals to act outside this sort of like area they've been allowed to work within, right? So you cannot have like kind of basically individuals working fully autonomously, because basically it'll tend to break the model's ability sort of to predict flows basically within the system. And consequently, kind of the overall solution is essentially kind of for people to start realizing what is it that I'm not allowed to do. And then you just have to go a little bit beyond, not breaking the law, but just find out exactly kind of what is it that I'm supposed to be doing, and then go a little bit beyond. That's fundamentally kind of how you break that system, right? But I mean, basically, if you
Can't
take
you
it,
break it by moving out of the channel entirely?
well, basically you can do that, but basically, I mean, you speak a lot about leakage basically to the system, right? Can I get fundamental? That's fundamental what it is, right? The system cannot cope with leakage. It needs full information. It's fun. I mean, if you, I'm sure you've read sort of Mises and Hayek kind of sort of back in the day, and they fundamentally kind of are quite detailed in this regard. Kind of essentially kind of get organizations which tend to centralize. They don't tend to let go again. They need to centralize a little bit more, and everything kind of is always stressed as some sort of, sort of technical sort of issue, kind of because this kind of they need to, sort of funnel even more power to kind of basically the few, and it's not terribly different really, kind of. But I mean, obviously this is systems analysis.
We have to embrace our inner leakage. We need to be leaky.
Well, this is the thing, right? So basically, kind of like about a few weeks ago, kind of spent a bit of time basically writing on, IMEC, kind of basically in the Middle East, right? And
I'm going to interrupt you. IMEC is the India, Middle East, Israel corridor. It's a new Silk Road for the West, goes through Saudi Arabia, Israel, UAE, and India, bypassing Iran and bypassing China's Silk Road, and probably bypassing the Suez Canal, almost certainly bypassing the Suez Canal. And it only was announced 2.5 years ago. It's a multi-billion dollar, maybe $1 trillion effort using ships, rail, pipelines, data centers, lots of fiber optic cable. Again, we're talking about moving goods, information, and oil and gas from,
Yeah.
and maybe hydrogen from India all the way to Europe through Saudi Arabia and Israel.
Yeah, that's absolutely correct. Basically, it's fundamentally like goods and energy and information, right? That's fundamentally kind of what they're sort of focusing on. Kind of basically what everyone is sitting talking about, that this is fundamentally a battle between kind of, the Western-based sort of solutions and the sort of Eastern, basically, which has got the Belt and Road Initiative, kind of basically courtesy of China. What no one is talking about, basically, in this regard, is fundamentally like, China works essentially kind of on basis of a fork of Enbridge, which is Bank for International Settlements, right? But the West are currently basically essentially kind of operating on Swift, but basically they're also researching Agora or BIS have got basically a similar project kind of for the West called Agora. Now, see,
Which is something the BIS developed, right? It's an experiment of the Bank for International Settlements.
yes,
Agora?
it's I forget. It's basically kind of comes down to sort of transnational sort of settling, basically kind of so you can trade with neighbors, etc. Right? Kind of basically, but like obviously the West it wants basically kind of more security, because basically they would like to be able to shut off like Russia, but like kind of basically Enbridge kind of like has been forked, kind of basically Russia forked it as well, which doesn't allow you kind of basically to implement kind of the same sort of curtailment of transaction, but at the same level.
So, Escape, my understanding is that Powell got the BIS to drop from active leadership of the Enbridge. Now, they're still using it, but BIS is no longer sort of promoting it thanks to the Fed. Is that true?
Yeah, but that doesn't really matter, because fundamentally what everyone is sort of forgetting is basically kind of whether it's the Eastern or the Western solution, both of them runs fundamentally on the same standards. And a while back, kind of basically wrote an essay called on Maxwell, kind of where I went through kind of sort of Maxwell family and sort of placed them relative to Epstein. And towards the end of the essay, kind of basically I pointed out that what the reason they've been so successful in building kind of this sort of state is that they fundamentally treated everything as an exercise in compartmentalization. And the way they've been able to so successfully basically kind of compartmentalize everything is essentially kind of basically by breaking each individual component into general systems theory components, and then basically kind of operates essentially kind of cooperate multiple components together through ISO standards. So essentially, kind of you have it like an interface.
ISO, okay, wait a minute. People don't know what ISO standards are. They're an
No,
international system designed by appointed people with no democratic accountability to create a set of standards that the whole world will need to follow. Is that correct?
yeah, it's perhaps I mean, I've read some boring documents. Kind of basically, these documents are boring. It's a perfect place to hide information, to be quite honest with you, because no one's going to read them. But yeah, basically, fundamentally, what they've done is say, for instance, kind of you got something in terms of sustainable finance, kind of basically it needs to be structured in a certain way, and then essentially, can you also have something with regards to governance, which needs to be structured in a certain way. So then you can take kind of basically multiple sort of components here, kind of general systems theory components, which effectively kind of basically comply kind of basically with these ISO standards, and just plug them together just like that. And it's fundamentally the same thing. If you look at basically the Bank for International Settlements Innovation Hub, right? Everything runs ultimately on the unified ledger, and the unified ledger is not an actual ledger. It's more of a description, basically, kind of a ledger to make sure that your ledger will be compatible with that of the neighboring country, right? Basically, kind of, and fundamentally, kind of basically what this is they've constructed kind of essentially a unified ledger, kind of basically all the Bank for International Settlements Innovation Hub projects. I effectively sort of think of them as applications which run on top of basically the sort of ledger. And the idea basically here then is essentially to say, for instance, like Norway wants to build their own CBDC implementation. Well, then they already have a template. They just need to plug it into kind of the local sort of requirements, kind of basically, and Pakistan 5 minutes later can do the same. So
Right,
consequently,
exactly. So if your nation follows these ISO standard, it's like you have a Lego piece that will then click into other Lego pieces from other countries and other industries, and it will all fit together. Is that right?
absolutely correct. That's fundamentally what it is. Everyone is basically kind of constructing all their sort of components of this sort of dystopian sort of future sort of vision, basically using the same sort of bricks.
So one of the things you've talked about is what are the real goals of the Iran war, and what is the West's hope to accomplish um, forcing Iran to do? Can you talk a little bit about what you think is happening?
I actually think you're fundamentally right. Kind of basically, it's about plugging the leakage. I think it's fundamentally perhaps the most important region of the world, which is not fully under the control, basically, of either the East or the West, because basically, as said, basically the Belt and Road Initiative is still complying kind of basically with all the BIS standards.
Right.
You got two blocks, right? Kind of essentially kind of, so you got the West and the East, and they're fighting out, and that's fine. Kind of essentially, and that fighting might very well be real. I mean, sort of might very well be real. It's very difficult to know, right? But ultimately, kind of it will be ultimately a question of who gets to sort of occupy the clearinghouse, if nothing else. The
So
clearinghouse.
what I see is there is a real fight between factions as to who controls what piece of the clearinghouse, particularly in their area. And that is a real fight. So,
I agree. I completely agree, and that's the reason kind of is why it seems real, because it is real. But fundamentally, it doesn't change the fact.
but they're not disagreeing about the clearinghouse. They're all agreeing about the clearinghouse. They're just fighting who's going to be middle management of what.
Exactly, and this is the thing, right? Kind of, quite recently, kind of, I wrote this essay on Julius Wolff, and no one knows who Julius Wolff is, and he's an interesting sort of character, right? Basically, kind of, because he's just so central to everything, and kind of like one of the documents I found, kind of, basically while sitting writing it, was basically kind of Walter Funk, who was basically was a Nazi economy minister, kind of basically of the Reich or whatever, all right, at the point in time, basically, since, and he's sitting describing the clearinghouse as if it's a Western document. I mean, like everything in there, kind of, he's just like, like it's just like, and you're sitting reading this document, you're sort of like holy moly, this is fundamentally kind of basically the same as everyone else, right? And then you notice the next link I dragged up was basically Keynes saying this is an excellent idea. We should do that in the West. And what do you know? Kind of that's fundamentally kind of what he proposed, just with basically Germany stripped kind of basically and replaced with sort of Great Britain, basically kind of, the fundamental sort of architecture kind of no one disagrees with, kind of basically all alignment basically regards the underlying architecture. And when you then look kind of basically, when you
So
look
they
at the
all want a clearinghouse, but and it almost doesn't matter who runs the clearinghouse. They all like the same kind of clearinghouse, but each nation or ruler or whoever is in charge can change the standards at will. We don't have access to the algorithms that are in that clearinghouse, but somebody else does, right? They can write them, they can change them. We don't know what they are, but our transactions, our life will depend on satisfying whatever those standards are. And we will be excluded from society if we don't adhere to those standards. So that's what's coming. It's not here now. We had pieces of it during COVID when in some places you could not go into a grocery store unless you had a pass that had been issued by your government, or you had a vaccine passport or something like that. So they were trying out pieces of it. Then they went away when the pandemic was over, but they're perfecting it, and they're going to bring it out again when more emergencies that may be deliberately caused, occur. And this could happen very soon. They need the Genius Act. They want this other act. What was it called? I've forgotten.
The Clarity Act.
Clarity Act. Yeah.
The
So
Clarity
they're
Act relates to digital tokens, the non-stablecoin part of crypto and distributed ledger technology. And the reason it's so important is that the BIS has a database of all assets in the world. Lots of other people do too. But what they want to do is they want to create for all real assets and for financial assets, all real financial assets, all financial assets, all real assets. They want to create a digital token on a distributive ledger that can be traded as programmable money or assets. And so all of the existing assets in the world, financial or real, can be traded on a distributed ledger that can have this control technology. And it's such a enormous vision that it's very difficult for people in the traditional financial system to fathom that they're really serious about doing this.
It's interesting because as part of that initiative, they're also changing. They're also changing effectively. In the old sort of days, kind of you had a deed on your house, right? But basically, when everything transitions to the unified ledger, you effectively don't really have the concept of ownership. You got the concept of control, basically. And if you lose that control, then effectively it's not yours. But yeah, the other thing, kind of basically, you were talking, Meryl, what you were talking about before with regards to COVID, right? COVID was, it like kind of from day one, kind of basically always felt really fake to me, and I wrote a number of sort of Substack essays basically on it. And one of the things was fundamentally kind of this was sort of the birth of indicator-based governance, where effectively kind of basically sort of the amount of people supposedly kind of carrying the disease would fundamentally dictate policy kind of in your nation. It's kind of, there was no democratic deliberation. There was surveillance information and questionable surveillance information at that, which fundamentally dictated policy. So yeah, basically, if you're looking at kind of basically where the world is going to go, yes, you're absolutely right. That is fundamentally kind of where we're going to go. But with regards to sort of introducing this kind of globally, kind of what you want to look at is essentially the UN emergency platform, because they're talking about complex global shocks, right? And complex global shocks effectively can only be measured basically fundamentally through AI, because it's going to bridge every single domain, right? Kind of basically from biodiversity, climate change to health, whatever, right? Kind of basically, and it's fundamentally kind of going to drag in so much surveillance information that no individual human can possibly rule on it. So they're completely, reliant upon kind of based sense of these black box computers kind of based, which obviously no one will ever take responsibility for. It's a perfect mechanism kind of based for hiding behind sort of sort of this black box model if you're in sort of an authoritarian dictator, so to speak.
And Escape, who gets to prove there's an emergency?
Well, that's a good question. Probably the International Institute for Applied Systems Analysis.
Okay.
I have to say.
So in the document UN put out, there were no standards. The Secretary General could call for an emergency if it affected more than one country. So that's what the UN proposed. A completely laissez-faire standard, which is no standard.
Yes.
And probably, what Escape Key is saying is they will probably implement some standards that will be put into an algorithm, and none of us will know what it is. And then they'll call an emergency, and we say, "What is it?" And they'll say, the computer, Socrates told me so, and
I think
and there
I
you
suspect
are. What are you going to do about it?
I
Who are you
suspect
going
I
to
suspect it's actually
call?
even worse. I suspect it's actually even worse than that, right? Because basically, kind of the One Health provisions of the pandemic treaty fundamentally sort of conflates, sort of, ecosystem health or whatever you want to have it, and livestock health and wildlife health and human health and ecosystem health as well. So that fundamentally means kind of basically compare these black box models. If an ecosystem sort of suffers in North America, kind of basically it might, per their models, influence the population of, I don't know, the Philippines, right? And there's no way kind of you can possibly sort of question this, right? It's what the model says, and consequently, kind of basically that's just fact in the universe. So consequently, it doesn't even need to be logical, kind of basically at that point in time. It just needs to basically be shielded from public scrutiny, which it is. Because basically, kind of you're talking about kind of sort of the climate change and stuff like that, which I've written plenty on. And I mean, look into the 70s, because I mean it's almost comical, basically, kind of where the politics kind of basically are announced before the science, right? Like kind of sort of 1975, kind of basically the first paper kind of basically on carbon pricing, sort of like kind of basically was announced, right? And in 1976. Bert Berlin stood in front of kind of US Congress and sort of said, we don't really know anything. So it's just like in the 1970s, it's just comedic in terms of kind of basically climate change, because it makes no sense. But yeah.
And at
So,
that point, they told us we were going into a new ice age. Not that it was getting too hot, but it was
Yes.
going to get too cold.
I'm a great believer that this system of total control is going to fail. And one of the reasons I believe it is if you look at the energy usage, if you sit down and look at the specifics of what because you're looking at a system that depends on enormous collection, analysis, and then feedback of data and information, essentially in real time. And so the data needs are extraordinary. And if you look at the projection of all the energy and resources that the data centers that they're trying to build in the United States need, I don't see how they get from here to there unless they bring out what I call breakthrough energy, which I don't know if they're willing or can do as a political matter. But it seems to me if you look at all the sort of environmental impact or energy usage, their plans don't make sense. They're not. I don't see how they're going to achieve this without a World War III among themselves.
I don't think they can, but I mean, fundamentally, um, the way I sort of see it is, what they're really trying to do is basically trying to eliminate sort of personal buffers or family buffers, right? So
Right.
if you have like kind of basically $1,000 kind of basically in your bank account, kind of you have some flexibility in regards to kind of whether you're forced to do X, Y, Z, right? And if you're trying to engineer a system of total control, you don't want people to have that option. You want people kind of basically to follow the rules. So they're trying to wipe out fundamentally kind of buffers throughout the entire system. And basically kind of by what they're forgetting as part of that is essentially those buffers are fundamentally what causes system stability over the long run, because basically there are fluctuations. So
Mhm.
when you attempt to sort of stabilize kind of basically an entire system, and you strip out those buffers, kind of basically what you're really doing is you're fundamentally creating, an incredibly brittle system, right? Kind of now, in addition to kind of what they're also doing at the same point in time, they're increasing the amount of sort of surveillance information, global surveillance. I mean, you go on Twitter or whatever, Facebook, you know, whatever kind of basically everything you do there is obviously sort of goes into a database somewhere, and every single time you spend £5 kind of based down the pub, it will go into a database somewhere, right? So they get kind of basically kind of more and more sort of information. They get sort of simulation of kind of basically what you're going to do, kind of basically, and they're going to forward predict on basis of those simulations. But when there's no buffers, when they gradually kind of strip out those buffers, what they fundamentally do is essentially kind of they strip out the possibility for the systems to sort of still sort of stabilized at the local level. And that fundamentally means kind of basically what you're doing is you're shifting a large amount of sort of, requirements upon the predictability kind of the sort of the accuracy kind of basically of the modeling. But the modeling kind of is never good enough because you cannot possibly capture all the information. So fundamentally, all you do is you progressively build up larger and larger black swans. So yeah, kind of basically you're not going to get like kind of 2008.
Oh,
You're
that's, something, Escape Key, that's a brilliant insight, because if you look at what they're planning on doing with the financial assets, first of all, it's going to be the mother of all bubbles, but the black swan possibilities are going to increase exponentially.
Yeah, I would
And
agree with that.
let me just throw in there that they are trying to get rid of safety deposit boxes. So in terms of you having buffers, they don't want you to have gold coins or diamonds and jewelry in a safe place anymore. They want you to have to sell those things because you don't have a place to put them. Banks are starting to close down their safety deposit box offerings, or they're not allowing new customers to have them. And I called a bunch of banks, and about 4 of them told me that I could not open a safety deposit box at their bank, that either they didn't have one, or they were in the process of shutting them down, or they were only for old customers. And I thought that was extraordinary. I mean, why would a bank want to give up a service that has basically been there forever? My entire lifetime, you've had safety deposit boxes to put your expensive jewelry, for instance. Why wouldn't you want to put your expensive jewelry in a safe place? And now the banks are telling you can't do that anymore. This to me is another way the system is becoming more brittle. The banks must have been told to do this. They couldn't have all come up with this same idea on their own simultaneously, just like what happened during COVID. They've been given instructions. Also, I tried to open a bank account, and I have to, they have these know your customer rules. So they get very invasive with the information. And then they want to know if you're a politically exposed person. Have you ever heard that term before?
Oh, yeah,
Politically
I've been turned down
Yeah.
in banks in Europe as a political exposed person, because I worked for the US government from 1989 to 1990.
Yeah. So, that is going to then play into your social credit score, whether you're politically exposed or not, or what, and they may debank you before they debank somebody else. But
I,
these are crazy standards that governments are imposing on the entities that we require to perform financial transactions. I mean, I can't pay for everything with cash. I need to have checks, and I need to wire money, etc. But the banks are not going to let me do that unless I am the right kind of person, or they'll close my account or tell me they can't open one for me.
I think they're trying to cut down basically on your on those safety deposit boxes because fundamentally they want everything tokenized. But
Exactly.
yeah, in addition to basically you're speaking about banks, right? Basically, I quite recently went through an absolute nightmare, kind of basically with banks, and no one could tell me basically what it was, and sort of decipher it myself. Basically, they wanted to see some bank statements, and I'd cashed out like a Coinbase account, like not a large amount of money, it's just a few sort of £1,000, against. They just went completely nuts about it, right? They wanted to know everything about this, right? And shortly thereafter, I found Score 60, of BIS. And fundamentally, what the BIS have sort of done is like, yeah, sure, we now sort of agree with basically sort of cryptocurrency, but we've set since the reserve ratio at 1,250%, which fundamentally means they need to keep basically full reserves, So if they got $1 worth of crypto, they need to keep basically a reserve of $1, since this measure. That makes it basically hugely expensive for the banks to hold, and consequently, basically no bank will want to do it. So basically, they saw my since bank statements, looked at crypto and sort of thought, nah, we don't want this guy.
Yeah, exactly. So many different ways they've come up with, and because they're sharing this information around the world, it's not so expensive to figure out what to do and how to control us. We're coming to the end. What more do you, Catherine, and Escape Key
Oh,
have to tell us about how we're going to get ourselves out of this mess.
Well, one of the ways we're going to get ourselves out of the mess is to be really grateful for the people who are helping get us out of this mess. And before we close Escape Key, I just want to tell you how grateful I am for your work. It's helped me enormously. It's helping a lot of people. We can't change anything unless we can see it. And you're making the invisible visible, and I'm just very grateful. And I hope you will keep letting us all know what we can do to help support you.
Well, much appreciated, and obviously eternally grateful kind of to both of you. You're doing a sort of fantastic job. Basically, kind of it's just it's great to be on the side with people who can actually explain things, because I'm not very good at that.
Oh, I think I find your Substack totally clear and coherent. It really explains things very, very well.
Yeah, I get a lot of comments kind of saying, it sounds very impressive. I have no idea what you're saying. So,
Well, you have to tell this, it's an important story and it has to be told differently for different groups of people. And you're able to tell it for the intellectuals and those who are in mathematical fields. And, it's up to Catherine and myself and others to try to tell the story in different ways and simplify it and make it accessible to everybody. And I'm thrilled that we can work together on that.
Well, it all sounds good. Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you so much. And we will see you very soon again. Bye-bye.
Cheerio.
And I was told, well, it's early terrible twos. It's, he just hit it early. Some kids do that, and his terrible twos are more dramatic. But the problem was that the terrible twos never quite seemed to end. So he started having just outbursts for things that were ridiculous. Like I would say, hey, I went to the grocery store and I got you your ice cream. It's on the table. Go have a bowl. What? No, I do not want ice cream. Why would you get me ice cream? I do not. And I'm just floored because it was his favorite ice cream and he's freaking out at me that I brought him ice cream. Just things that were not normal. And it was like that for everything. Things he wanted to do, things he enjoyed. All of a sudden he's raging about, to the point where it was very disruptive to our family.
And how long was he like this for until you sought help?
Yeah, so when he was young, I didn't have because I had a girlfriend whose son had autism, and I had heard some things about vaccines and mercury, and he's oh no, that's fine, take the mercury out, this couldn't be causing any of this problem. He just has a bad attitude and a strong wolf. I came across him and I thought, I wonder if he could help me. But I also thought, I have this child who loves shows like Blue Bloods and is considering maybe law enforcement. I don't want my kid to have a record. I don't want him labeled as having some psychiatric problem where he won't be able to get the job he wants in the future. I'm just going to see if we can keep dealing with this. Well, at that time, my mom had gone to see another holistic practitioner for some things that were wrong with her health. And we found out we have a MTHFR mutation in our family. And so my mom said, hey, this doctor recommends that we put you guys on high dose methylated B12. And so when we did that, we started seeing some big changes in his behavior, but it was still weird, not normal. I've got videos in my phone of him just for my own, documentation to show the doctor of what was going on.
Had the school picked up on his behavior as well?
Yeah, so that was interesting. At school, he was a little more passive aggressive in his opposition, and he didn't get sent to the principal or anything for raging. He confined that more to family environments. Friends who were with me saw it. At school, he kind of held it together. The problem at school was everyone told me your child's genius, smart, and just basically giving us the middle finger when it comes to working and doing things because he just doesn't feel like it. So that was kind of how he learned to master, I think, what he didn't want to do at school was I'm just not doing it. Things like having to take the same math class 3 times when he tested off the charts smart in math because he just didn't feel like passing. So all of those things were kind of adding up to me to tell me we still had a problem and I needed to figure out how to get my kid better. So that's when I found the psychiatrist, and I said, okay, at 15, I said
15 years old.
Yes, I just decided I can't do this anymore. We have to figure out what's gonna help him, if anything, or is this just what we're dealing with for the rest of our lives? So I took him in for a brain scan. So they do 2 days of testing at the Amen clinics, where one day you go in and they do a battery of tests with your brain at rest, and then the next day they give you a task that helps your brain get active, and then they test it that way as well. And then they sit down and kind of go over the results with you. So when they showed me a normal scan and then they showed me my son's scan, everything made sense. His brain was lit up around the outside, which they call brain on fire, and basically didn't have an explanation for me as to how that happened, which at that point, I didn't know it was the vaccines. I didn't even think that. I just knew something was wrong and we needed to fix it. And so they started giving him all kinds of supplements that ultimately pulled heavy metals out of his brain. And then I started asking, why would heavy metals be in his brain? And that kind of started me down my journey with the truth about vaccines.
Now, what was the last vaccine he had? How old was he?
The last vaccine he had was a flu shot in 2014.
So quite old.
Yes. Yeah. I literally have a picture of all 4 of my children sitting on the pediatrician's table waiting for their flu shot, because that's how you keep your child healthy, right? And it just turns my stomach now to think about it. I did learn enough about vaccination before my daughter was a teenager. In California, they make you have a Tdap booster before you start junior high school.
Right.
And I had followed a naturopath who said, even if you believe in vaccines, which at that point I didn't know why you wouldn't believe in vaccines, you don't want to do them during puberty because everything's firing off, and if something's going to go wrong, that will go wrong. So I had gotten my pediatrician to write an exemption for her for that vaccine, but Trevor had already passed that. We'd already been through that with him, and he'd already gotten that before we.
And how is he today? How is his health?
He's amazing. So after about a year of being on the supplements, it was like I had a brand new kid. My happy baby was back. It literally made me want to cry. I remember praying every night, just God, please give me back my happy baby. Like I don't know what to do, and just guide me and direct me. And he is that happy child again. He still has lingering health issues, I think, from the vaccines. He's got celiac disease, and I think there's a lot going on with gut health with vaccines personally from my research, and so that is an ongoing struggle, is his gut health. But his brain is pretty much restored to where he's functional, he's not oppositional, the brain on fire, where I've not seen any of that in years now.
So what's your message to the people watching, or that young mum you used to be?
Yeah, I try and tell all the young moms I know, please do your research before you hand your baby over to anyone who wants to stick anything inside of them. Go online to Physicians for Informed Consent or Children's Health Defense or any of these different groups that are trying to actually give you informed consent. The only informed consent I ever got with a vaccine was we were traveling to Africa, and they told me my children needed a yellow fever vaccine. And so I asked my pediatrician, hey, I've heard bad things can happen with this, and he said, yeah, let me ask the infectious disease specialist at the hospital. And so he went to Children's Hospital of Orange County's infectious disease specialist and got the pros and cons of having that vaccine, and that was the only time ever that anyone gave me informed consent.
Did you give them the yellow fever?
I did. The choice was body bag if they got yellow fever at that point. I don't know if that was even the truth, but that was what I was told. Body bag or risky vaccine that they admitted to me was risky and could cause some problems. So
body bag or risky vaccine?
Yes.
My goodness.
Mm-hmm. That's what I was told.
By the infectious disease people or by your doctor?
By the infectious disease people at Children's Hospital of Orange County. So at that point, it was 2011. And then they also wanted you to keep boosting that yellow fever every 10 years. And I was like, oh, I can't imagine doing that every 10 years, but we're just going to do it once. And then, of course, they've since come out and said, oh, no, you don't even need to boost it. And there's just so many things that started happening that made me ask questions.
Did they have any adverse effects from the Yellow fever?
Not that I saw immediate, but I think, so much is culmination.
Is there anything else you want to add to the story?
The only thing I would say is that don't ever give up hope. Don't ever give up on your children. I completely believe in the power of prayer and asking God to direct you and guide you. And I am just so adamant that everyone needs to be a conscientious parent. And again, I thought I was being conscientious by injecting my kids, but I didn't know what was being injected into them. So ask the questions and demand answers of these people. Just because they're wearing a white coat doesn't mean that they know everything and that they have your best interests or your child's best interests at heart.
Beautifully said. Thank you so much for your story.
This and all CHD TV programming is made possible by generous support from viewers like you. Please consider making a contribution today to keep our programming going strong. Thank you.